Hi, my name is Emily and welcome to Secret Parents. In today's video, I'm really excited to be sharing my top 12 tips for working with fuzzy or faux fur yarn. So my original faux fur yarn journey started with about 4 years ago when I crocheted a Christmas stocking, and I wanted to add faux fur to the cuff of the stocking. And so I used, at that time I used Line Brand Go for Faux, and that was my first time using faux fur yarn. And I think whenever somebody starts using a new yarn or starts crocheting, there's always some challenges and definitely a learning curve. And so now over the last 4 years, I've crocheted over 800 items using faux fur yarn. So that is kind of my experience with faux fur yarn. So in today's video, I'm really hoping to be able to share with you my top 12 tips that I've learned over these last 4 years of making over 800 crochet pieces with faux fur yarn. So let's go ahead and jump into the video. Tip number one with working with faux fur yarn is to feel for your stitches. So when you're working with faux fur yarn, typically there's kind of like a thicker area, and then you worked your stitch, there's a thicker area, and then there's a thin, like more of a hole. That's where you're going to take your hook and work your next stitch into. Hopefully that makes sense. Basically, you'll kind of want to feel for the area that has more of a hole, and that is where you will work your stitches into. So tip number two is to, when you're working with faux fur yarn, that you can actually just tie a knot to weave in your tails. So I personally, with having made over 800 crochet items, have found that I really like to tie 2 little knots with my tail that I have left over once I finish my project, and just cut my yarn. And typically it hides really, really well, because with fuzzy or faux fur yarn, it really just blends in and you won't notice the little knot or the little tail that you still have, like that little tiny tail. So that's what I personally love to do with when I'm working with faux fur yarn, and especially weaving in tails. Tip number 3 is to use lots of stitch markers. I cannot emphasize this tip enough because it's really something that is super important. I personally like to mark my first stitch of the round with a stitch marker, and then if I'm doing lots of increases or something that is hard to feel for with just my fingers, I will happily add more stitch markers than just one to my round. So I typically have the first stitch of the round marked, and then any stitches that I feel like are complicated, or I would like to just make sure I'm doing the right stitch. Or if like you're working all double crochets and then you go down to half double crochets, I typically will mark when my first half double crochet, because that really helps me. Otherwise you're having to count your stitches, and it just gets a lot harder. When you're working with typical yarn, you can see, oh, I went from a double crochet down to a half double crochet. But when working with faux fur yarn, you can't really see that. So make sure to use lots of stitch markers, and I love the Clover & More stitch marker brand. They're just way easier to work with than the typical cheap plastic stitch markers that you can buy on Amazon. So make sure to use Clover & More stitch markers as well. I'll put a link in the description box down below to my favorite stitch markers. Tip number 4 is to use a larger hook size. So typically with lots of amigurumi patterns or different patterns, you would size down from like what the recommended hook size is on your label. And especially with faux fur yarn, if you're just using like Bernat blanket yarn, which is kind of a fuzzy yarn but not faux fur yarn, I wouldn't size down as much. But if you're using a really thick faux fur yarn, like any of these, faux fur yarns, I would definitely size up a hook size, or at least do what the yarn label recommends. So let's say, for example, that we crochet Fable Fur, now I believe it's called Fairy Tale Yarn, but that this yarn recommends, we're just using an example, let's say it recommends a 7mm crochet hook. It's a number 6 super bulky weight, so a 7mm crochet hook. I would typically size up a hook, or at least do that. I would not size down a hook, because with faux fur yarn, it tends to hide, like, so if you're working with an amigurumi project, it tends to hide the stuffing really well, so you don't have to worry too much about that. And it's a lot easier to work into your stitches when you have a little bit of a bigger hook size. Tip number 6 is to count your stitches as you go or after the end of each round. When working with faux fur yarn and feeling your stitches, it's super easy to skip a stitch, and so I definitely like to count my stitches. I don't really enjoy counting my stitches, but for faux fur yarn, especially when you're just starting out, I definitely think it's a great idea to be doing. And so yeah, whether you count your stitches as you go or when you're done you count your stitches, that's definitely a good tip to follow. Tip number 7 is to pair your faux fur yarn with regular yarn. Now, this isn't always necessary, but if you're really struggling with faux fur yarn, especially if you're using a really high pill faux fur yarn like the Premier Bunny yarn, which is just really, really thick, you can use like a different, so another ball, but just of regular yarn. So like, let's say that this color matched this like worsted weight yarn. You could use these two strands together, pretend like they're one strand, and that might be able to help you find your stitches a little bit easier. So that is just another tip that if you're, especially if you're using, like I mentioned, really thick, high pill, like really high, like thick, tall pill yarn, definitely would recommend, if needed, to use another strand of just regular yarn along with it, just to help you be able to feel and see your stitches easier. Tip number 8 is to look for the V. Now, whenever you're crocheting with faux fur yarn, I personally like to look at the top. If I'm really struggling, you can look at the top and you'll see this little V, and that is where the next stitch is. And you can't always see it on especially the thicker faux fur yarns like the bunny yarn, but on the thinner yarns like the Fable Fur from We Crochet, you will be able to see these, see the V a lot easier. So make sure to be looking for that little V on the top like you would when you're starting crochet. Make sure to do it now when you're using faux fur yarn. Tip number 9 is to have the wrong side of your work face out when you're done with your project. So let's say you're working on an amigurumi project and you are working in the round. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to actually, instead of having the right side facing out, as you're crocheting, the right side will face out. Instead, you'll want to flip it inside out and you'll want to have the wrong side facing out. And the reason for that is because the wrong side of your work is way more fuzzy, and so way more soft and fuzzy than the right side. Don't ask me why, but that is just how it is. Whenever I'm working with like even Christmas stockings, I like to make sure that I flip my stocking out so that the wrong side is facing out, because it's just way more fuzzy and it looks way more cute. Tip number 10 is when crocheting with faux fur yarn to make sure and try to not make a magic circle with the faux fur yarn. So what I mean by that is whenever you're working with faux fur yarn, the little faux fur fibers tend to get stuck as you're working over the magic circle. So if you, let's say, make a magic circle and half double crochet 8 into the magic circle, and then once you've done all those 8 stitches, if you try to pull on that tail, it won't come. And typically, don't ask me how I know, whenever you pull, it breaks. So what you'll want to do is when you're working with a magic circle, you'll either want to start with a different yarn and not work with faux fur yarn for the magic circle when making the magic circle. So then when making the magic circle, work with like regular yarn, and then when starting to work into the magic circle, you can use faux fur yarn. Or if you're using faux fur yarn for the magic circle, what you can do is after each stitch, make sure to pull on that tail so that it doesn't get stuck when you finish all your stitches and you break your yarn. So then tip number 11 is to take your time. Whenever working with faux fur yarn, it does take me a little bit longer to crochet, but it's definitely worth it. I really love the look of faux fur yarn, and so it's so much fun. As you start working more and more with faux fur yarn, it's really fun to it becomes really fun to work with it. And now I would say that's probably my favorite yarn to work with is Faux Fur Yarn, especially the We Crochet Fable Fur. And I would say also the Hobie Peacock yarn is really fun to work with. As even now, after crocheting over 800 pieces, the Premier Bunny yarn is a little bit harder to work with. So if you're just starting with working with Faux Fur Yarn, I'd probably not recommend the Premier Bunny yarn. Instead, I would recommend the We Crochet Fable Fur, or the also it's basically the same if you use Lion Brand Gopher Faux. That's basically the same as We Crochet Fable Fur, but just make sure whenever you buy Lion Brand Gopher Faux that it's not thick and quick. There's Lion Brand Gopher Faux, and then there's Lion Brand Gopher Faux Thick and Quick, and you want the Lion Brand Gopher Faux because that's the number 6 super bulky weight, just like this one, this pink. And so that's what I would recommend. Then tip number 12 is to not worry about perfection when working with this yarn, because you're never gonna see mistakes unless they're major. You're not gonna really see much for mistakes, and so I've made lots of mistakes when working with it. And as long as as long as it's not a major mistake, obviously, I do not worry too much about frogging my work and taking out those stitches. If it's not too obvious, I am totally fine leaving it in. And then the bonus tip, number 13, is to use fuzzy yarn only for the accents. So if you're really struggling with, even after all these tips with working with Faux Fur Yarn, I would recommend that you use the Faux Fur Yarn more as like the little accents. So if you're making like a little bear, use it for the inside of the ears. Or if you're making a fox, use the inside of the ears as Faux Fur Yarn. If you're really struggling, do littler, smaller parts with Faux Fur Yarn, and then do the rest with whatever yarn you prefer. So that's just my little bonus tip that I really like to use if you're struggling with Faux Fur Yarn. So hope you enjoyed all of these tips. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to like this video. That really helps more crocheters like you find this channel. And so thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in next week's video. Bye!